So guys, I've been making Tengu Plant content for over a year now, and one thing I have learned and taken away from doing so is there are a lot of people who make really dumb and terrible takes about the format. I see so many crazy things come out and literally no one gets to address them. So in this video, I'm going to do the super video. I am going to compile the list of all the things I hear people say that is just blatantly untrue about Tengu Plant format, and I'm going to talk about them, and not only talk about them, I'm going to demonstrate why they are incorrect, just so we can showcase just how incredible this format is. Because I swear there's like a full-on propaganda campaign against it sometimes. I don't know, maybe I'm crazy. I probably am. But anyway, doesn't matter. Let's get right into it. So one of the most common ones I've been hearing as of lately, this one's come up a lot actually lately, is people saying that Tengu Plant isn't a diverse format because it's named Tengu Plant format, therefore meaning that it is based on the fact that Tengu Plant is just far and away the best deck of the format. Now, that is completely untrue for multiple reasons, but just to break it down, you know, we've seen across history, you've seen formats like GOAT, for example. GOAT Control isn't the best deck in GOAT format, but you know what it was? Probably the most popular, in the same way that Tengu Plants is also one of the most popular decks of this format. Is it the best? Not really, and we have some tournament results to show for it. So let's just take a look at YCS Toronto out the gate. YCS Toronto historically had 10 different decks in the top cut of its tournament, which is honestly pretty good, but honestly I think we could do a bit better to showcase the true diversity of this format. So this right here is the Tengu Plant Discord, probably the most active scene for Tengu Plant tournaments. We have tournaments every single month, some with free entry, some with cash prizes, but there are at least 2 tournaments going on per month in this server. And so we have a lot of tournament results to kind of showcase what modern Tengu is looking like. And if you take a look, we have seen crazy things win in top, all the way from seeing, you know, Piper Quick Draw, we've seen, you know, zombies, we've seen Gravekeepers, we've seen Card Curry, Light Sworn is one, all kinds of stuff. But, you know, to make this simple, I'm going to pull up a nice little graphic for you guys so you can take a look and see exactly how many of each deck has topped. So since this Discord has swapped over from the Columbus to the Toronto pool, we have seen 32 vastly unique decks top in this year alone. And while Tengu Plants is at the top of how many times it has topped, it's only because of the fact that this deck sees more representation than literally any other deck. Like I said, it's far and away the most popular, but it's not necessarily the best, because while we've seen it top a total of 14 times, you can also look at all the other decks that have topped, going as far as things like Crusher Control. Just kind of weird stuff has managed to make it, which if the format was really oppressive, if the meta was super strong, then these decks wouldn't be able to function. But to prove my point a bit further, let's take a look at what decks have actually won tournaments. So we've had 20 tournaments total this year, and out of those 20 tournaments, Tengu Plants has managed to win 4 of them. These are the remaining decks that have also won tournaments, and we have 15 unique decks that have actually won the entire tournament itself. So as you can see, again, if Tengu Plants is seeing representation at literally all of them, it would consistently be able to like dominate these tournaments. And while it has seen frequent tops, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's topping every tournament, nor is it winning every tournament while seeing constant representation. Obviously, these numbers could be a bit skewed because the tournaments aren't crazy big. We usually see a range between 20 to 50 people in our tournaments, but you know, for a small format that we're trying to grow, it's relatively decent numbers. You could maybe cut some of these lists down a bit, but I think it's very safe to say that this is one of the most, if not the most diverse formats in Yu-Gi-Oh's history. There are countless decks that dominate, and what I attribute that mostly to is the fact that Tengu Plant format does not have oppressive meta. All of the meta decks have drawbacks. For example, Tengu Plants is weak to the likes of Maxx C. Agents has to run 3 vanilla bricks in it, and so those decks are good, but they're not incredible. They have weaknesses, and they're completely manageable. And in addition to that, we also have a ton of generic counterplay in the format, in the likes of Solemn Warning, Effect Veiler, even Maxx C. There's just generic cards that can answer a lot of different decks, which then means that you're not necessarily oppressed no matter what strategy you're going for. You can play a lot of different options and still see success because of the generic counterplay, as long as you can get your small engine or archetype to function in some degree or way. Going alongside the last claim, I also need to bring up this one because I hear this one a lot, which is people saying that Edison is more diverse than Tengu, which I also find to be really bizarre because alongside the data I just showed you of all the decks that have topped, I mean, 32 different decks in less than a year is kind of crazy, but going alongside that, we also have to think about the fact that it is a full year of more cards that have came out from 2010 to 2011. If you want to go through the sets, we'll put them all up here. In addition to these sets releasing brand new archetypes that were completely unplayable in Edison, or at least adding the cards to make the deck functional. In the example of Infernity, you know, they had Infernity Archfiend, but they didn't have anything else. We'll put the list right here. And don't even get me started about all the decks and archetypes that got one single card of support or a few cards of support in these sets that just went from being borderline unplayable in Edison to actually really good. And, you know, we also got to talk about just why this really is. Why is this diversity so relevant? And I think one thing that also supplements it alongside the generic counterplay I've already talked about. But we also need to mention the fact that Pot of Duality is in this format, and Pot of Duality is an excellent card for boosting a deck viability, especially if it's a slower deck. If it's a slower deck that isn't as fast as some of the more meta-oriented decks, it can kind of tend to keep up and still see consistency through the likes of Duality, and the faster decks don't really benefit a ton from Duality because of the no special summon clause. So this enables a lot of these decks to become way more viable than they ever have been, and it's a lot less random than it is in previous formats. So again, I really don't know where this whole propaganda campaign of saying Edison is more diverse than Tengu is, because if you just look at the numbers, and, you know, just look at the different decks that are topping and what's available, a year's worth of cards is just a year's worth of cards, man. There's just no way that there's a format more diverse than Tengu, especially given just how diverse the format is and just what is available. There's just more available, man. It's just numbers. Now, obviously, available card pool isn't just what contributes to whether or not a format is diverse. Obviously, we already touched on this in the fact that there's generic counterplay to everything, and then a lot of consistency added through the likes of Duality with a non-oppressive meta. That's what's really going to put this format over the edge and make it as diverse as it really is. So, but I think it's really safe to say that this format is definitely not less diverse than Edison. You know, you can maybe compare the two, but I would easily say that it's more diverse, just given that there's 23 brand new archetypes that come into the mix alongside all the decks that just get inherently better. So now we're moving on to my favorite part of the video, which is all the cards that apparently ruin the format. A lot of people make these claims about certain cards, and we're going to start with one I've already talked about, which is Pot of Duality. I've heard many people make the case that Pot of Duality activates and lets you Royal Tribute every single game in Gravekeeper. So let's see how that actually works. Honestly, this whole thing coincides with people saying that Royal Tribute ruins the format because Gravekeepers are playable, but I honestly wanted to give a fair test. I would honestly say that I think this is just placebo. At the end of the day, people complain about this card because it does feel bad to have resolved against you, but I wanted to test how often does this actually happen? How often can you turn one Royal Tribute? So let's take a look. This is Himne's build of Gravekeepers. Now, Himne plays this deck in tournaments. He's topped with it multiple times, and this is as turbo to Royal Tribute as you could possibly imagine. You know, he's on 3 Upstart, 3 Wonder Wand, 3 Duality, the 2 Royal Tribute, and then obviously the Necro Valley. So I decided to test 50 hands of this deck, going as deep as I possibly could, just to see what would happen. So let's take a look at that experiment. So here's how my experiment worked. Anytime I would manage to get a turn 1 Royal Tribute off, I would mark Y in the chat, and anytime I was incapable of doing so, I would mark an N for no. Keep in mind that when you play Royal Tribute, you have to activate it alongside a Necro Valley. So if I saw one without the other, I would not count that as a playable turn 1 Royal Tribute, because obviously it's not there, it can't be played, so it's not a turn 1 Royal Tribute. That being said, I also didn't play out my turns 100% optimally. Now, for example, if I open a Gravekeeper Spy and only a Spy, and then a Wonder Wand, I would normal summon the Spy and then activate Wonder Wand to draw 2, even though most Gravekeeper players probably wouldn't do that. They would just set the Spy, but I wanted to go as ham as possible to try to hit that turn 1 Royal Tribute, just to see how probable it was, even if you're playing borderline suboptimally for the turn. So that's how this went, and my results ended up being, after 50 attempts, I saw Royal Tribute turn 1 15 times out of 50, which amounts to around 30% to 28%. But also, one thing to keep in mind is one of my hands I saw Royal Tribute was with 4 monsters, so it was Necro Valley, Royal Tribute, and 4 monsters, which likely means you're not slamming that Royal Tribute because you don't want to lose your entire hand. And then, like I said, because of the fact that I was playing suboptimally, I think it's safe to say we could round this down to about at least 13 to 12 times total out of 50, which would amount to around 25 to 30%, which is not a crazy number by any means, and especially when we're considering the fact that we are playing suboptimally. So, you know, it's honestly a relatively low number. One other thing to consider when thinking about this, because some people are still worried about that frequency for whatever reason. The other thing to think about is Royal Tribute in Gravekeepers is also very matchup dependent. If you go against a deck that's running a lot of back row, like for example Heroes, let's say you turn one Royal Tribute and you hit an Alias out of their hand and they have a bunch of back row, well then you're likely not going to have a huge impact in that matchup. Same thing goes for things like TG, stuff like that. There are certain decks where they just set a bunch of back row and they don't see a ton of monsters. So if there's chances where you can hit one or nothing and the card doesn't have any impact at all. So that's definitely something to think about when you're looking at these results, because you have to go first. You have to go against a deck that has a heavy monster count, and then the Royal Tribute can potentially win you a game, which means realistically, this card is not winning Gravekeeper players a ton of matches, and I would definitely not consider this to be a big problem that people tend to make it out to be. Oh boy, garbage take number 2, my personal favorite, and they always slam it and they know that it's not true, and it always comes from people who honestly don't play Tengu format at all, but people always come at me and say that Maxx C ruins the format. So let's take a look at why that is just completely false. So first and foremost, if you want a very, very in-depth look at this, a long time ago on my channel, I did a video that highlights literally the impact of Maxx C on every single meta deck, even remotely close to meta deck in Tengu Plant format. I talk about how it gets impacted, when the best time to Maxx C is, all those different things, and I'll put a link to that video in the description. I'm not going to get into all those details, but I swear to God, half the people who say Maxx C is the problem are the same people who are going to Maxx C the tour guide on summon just for your opponent to slam a Sengen, and then you get to draw a single card and then be like, wait, that didn't do anything. So let's start this off by looking at historical Tengu Plant format. So this is YCS Toronto, and I know a lot of people are saying like, oh, back in the day they were behind in deck building and stuff like that. To a degree, that was somewhat true. But I would also say that, if you actually look at all of the top cut of YCS Toronto, did you know half of top 32 was not maining or siding Maxx C? And in fact, as someone who played the format historically myself, I remember definitely prioritizing Valor over Maxx C, just because Valor is way more generically useful across the board in random matchups, and at the very least, it's a one-star tuner, where you compare it to Maxx C. Maxx C doesn't really do anything if it's useless in a matchup, which means it can feel really, really bad to draw comparably to Valor, which you can still make some plays with. But we can take a look at top 4. Top 4 YCS Toronto. We had 3rd, 4th place. No Maxx C in main. No Maxx C inside. Going on to Tyler Nolan's TG stun. No Maxx C in main. No Maxx C inside. And then finally we go to Agents, which also has, this was 2nd place, had no Maxx C, maining triple effect Valor, but no Maxx C in main and no Maxx C inside. And then Billy Break going for his standard 2 Valor, 2 Maxx C. So he has 2 Maxx C in main. And then lastly, no Maxx C inside. This was just a 2-2 ratio. I think at the time this was actually a pretty smart ratio, especially with how popular plants were. Having the extra Maxx C is going to give you a little bit of wiggle room in the mirror match. But for the most part, this card was clearly not crazy. If this card was like Thanos good, then I think Billy would have probably been siding an extra copy. And for the most part, if we take a look at modern iterations of Tengu, most players in Tengu Plant format are kind of doing the same way. They either don't main or side it at all, or it's typically just going to be in their side deck at 3, because at the end of the day, it sees most of its impact versus the likes of Tengu plants. Other decks, it really doesn't impact that much. Most of the decks have really nice stopping points and don't really feel the burn as much as you think, especially if, you take a look at my breakdown of all the different decks, you're going to see that most of the decks just really don't feel it that bad, unless they're playing cards that just blatantly get exploited by it. But for the most part, Maxx C, it just hurts plants, which at the end of the day is really positive for the format. It's not like how people always look at the card through the lens of Modern and they say, oh, in Modern, if I get Maxx C, then I'm just going to get OTK'd on my next turn. But Tengu Plant format isn't that fast. You're not going to get OTK'd, and Maxx C has plenty of completely viable stopping points. And in fact, a lot of times, even if you're giving your opponent a +1, like for example, if you summon a tour guide and make a Leviathan, you're making that Leviathan to kill a monster. So they're going to draw 2 cards, so they're getting a +1, but then you're killing a monster for a -1, so it honestly balances out. It's really not at the level that people just like explode on it. In fact, I can confidently say, as someone who watches tournaments every single month and has been playing this format actively, I see Maxx C impact probably less than 5% of matchups. unless someone is playing really poorly into it. It's honestly a really easy card to play around. And I'd say it's probably one of the most skillful cards in the entire format. There's a lot of like ways in which it actually elevates play, where you have to play very intelligently, like to bait it out so you can combo off later or stuff like that. It's actually a really cool card in the format and doesn't have any level of the impact that people think it does. And just to go a step further, we can take a look at other formats. And this card really, Maxx C really didn't see any relevancy until way later in like Yu-Gi-Oh! But for some reason, people just remember this card being so oppressive just because of the lens of Modern. So just as an example, we're going to jump ahead 2 years to YCS Miami. This is right before Dragon Rulers format, where I think Maxx C actually saw a lot of relevancy, where you'd want to run it because of how oppressive Dragon Rulers were and how good it was against Dragon Rulers. But this is Wind Up OTK format. Like, Wind Up OTK, this is a deck that comboed off and special summoned a million times in a single turn. Take a look at the first place in YCS Miami. We see no Maxx C in main, 2 Maxx C inside. And then you can keep going. We'll to look at the third place Karakuri list. No Maxx C in main, no Maxx C inside. Clearly, this card just didn't have that level of impact that people were like thinking. Looking at Mermails, this was Billy Break again. No Maxx C in main, 2 Maxx C inside. So like very low ratios on the card. The card is just not as crazy as people tend to think. And again, this is 2 years later in YCS Miami. The card really went an extended period of time without being horrendously broken until probably around 2015, 2016, where the gameplay really shifted from being extremely special summon oriented, where every turn involved a ton of special summoning. But prior to that, the gameplay was really slow and honestly really balanced, where you're not really going to see a ton of value from Maxx C, and Valor in a lot of cases is just going to be better. And just to continue off this point, there's another claim people make alongside the fact that Maxx C ruins the format, is they say Maxx C locks players into certain like suboptimal decks, or it creates RNG in the deck building process where you feel obligated to play heroes or stun decks because of the fact that Maxx C exists in the format and you can't play combo. It's like a gamble. But like, just as an example from historical speaking, if you look at YCS Miami, we see Desmond Johnson playing Teleport Karakuri. Keep in mind, Maxx C is at 3, and he's on like full on like pure aggro Karakuri, and he got top 4 at the YCS. You know what I'm saying? Like, in Tengu Plant format, literally any deck is viable. As you guys have seen from the results I showed earlier when we talked about diversity, there's literally countless decks that are possible in this format. So it's completely obscure and crazy to say that this forces you on slower decks. I have never seen anyone be like terrified of it. And at the end of the day, if you are afraid of Maxx C, if you are absolutely terrified by Maxx C, I just want you guys to know that there is an out, and it is called Debunk. The card Debunk is legal in Tengu Plant format. It's a trap that you can side in. If your deck is more special summon oriented, side in Debunks and you have answers to the likes of Valor and Maxx C. There is counterplay to literally every single card in Tengu Plant format, so if there's something you dislike, just side a little extra hate for it and you're gonna be fine, you know? Will you potentially lose a game to Maxx C? Maybe occasionally, but like I said, I would say it's less than 5% of the games I've ever seen where Maxx C is just a top contributor to a matchup. Yeah, you thought I was finished, but guess what? I'm not finished, because everyone else loves to beat this dead horse, so I'm going to keep it going until we're all on the same page here, how little of an impact Maxx C actually has in the format. So this right here you're looking at is a stream I recently had in tournament where I was watching Shinuslaw play X-Sabers, and I saw Maxx C probably have its largest impact I have seen, period. And the reason for that is because his opponent, your worst nightmare, had a large board, and Shinuslaw was forced to make an extension to try to out it, and he gets Maxx C'd at the most obvious spot off of a Bogart Knight. This is like an X-Sabers nightmare. This is like the worst case scenario for X-Sabers, and typically you could just stop if you weren't in such a bad position. So at this point, I'm honestly under the impression that Shinuslaw is just going to lose. But as you guys can see, is even though his opponent draws multiple cards and ends up being a total of like, I think +4 on him, Shinuslaw makes a single couple plays and ends up bringing back the entire advantage. He brings the advantage back to even just off of a few good plays. And then to take it a step further, Shinuslaw actually even goes on to win this game. So at its most impactful, it still didn't have the level of impact that people like to claim it does, which is why it is not as big of a deal as people like to say. And this honestly speaks lengths to just how incredible this format is, and the fact that you can kind of have something happen that looks borderline catastrophic and still manage to kind of climb your way back into a game just because of a few good plays, and just how back and forth and swingy this format really is. It just really speaks to the level of skill required to pilot and play these decks as optimally as possible, regardless of what counterplay options are available. People like to say BLS is a problem. All right, listen, I understand the hate towards BLS. It makes sense. I know why some people don't like it. But again, I feel like this is another one of those placebos where you have it slammed against you one time and it feels really, really bad at that exact moment. So you're just like, oh, this card should be banned. It's too broken. But at the same time, there really are a lot of tools that deal with BLS. And we'll list them all right here. Remember that thing I said about counterplay? Listen, guys, there are plenty of power cards in Yu-Gi-Oh! But in my opinion, I can't find a card to be a true problem unless there are just very limited or unrealistic tools to counterplay that card. Obviously, BLS can win some games, but also when every deck is maining triple Valor and double Solemn Warning, and even things like Torrential, Dark Hole, Mind Control, there's so many outs to the card. It really doesn't feel to me like this is something that's going to be like blowing you out of the water every single game. Will you lose to it? Probably. It's a good card, but is it going to just completely define every matchup? Definitely not. Let's also just keep in mind just how many little mind games go in with BLS. BLS is obviously very strong because it can attack a monster and then attack directly, sometimes for even game. But when you add monsters in here and, you know, different scenarios, there's a lot of variables that can actually come up. For example, do you want to attack into your opponent's set monster in the event that it could be a Sangan and it could search something, could save them, like a Battle Fader, or even if you're not going to end the game, you'll really want to give them a search. Sometimes it's better to use the effect and just banish the card. But if you get Valored, then you can't declare an attack, so you're not going to be able to out their monster, which means on the next turn they could flip it and then synchro with it or something like that. The other thing is let's say you decide not to use the effect and declare an attack. Then your opponent, before you attempt to go into battle phase, your opponent can pitch the Valor to make it so your BLS can only attack once and then is forced to attack into the monster. And let's say Valor isn't a variable at all in this scenario. So we'll put it back on top of the deck. If Valor's not like a variable and they swing into your Sangan, for example, let's say they go for the direct attack. You have to decide if this is actually a worthwhile attack to go for, because then they can special summon Gores and get a 3k token, which can then just out the BLS anyway. So there's a lot of weird variables like that where you have to kind of think about how you want to play. A lot of times people will have to hold the BLS attack until the very final attack. So then if they drop a Gores, they can just clear through both copies of the Gores. But that still doesn't mean you're necessarily ending the game. So there's just a lot of little things that go towards BLS, but I think it's a bit of a stretch to call this just a major problem in the format. It's a super powerful card. Don't get me wrong, guys, but is it a problem? I'd say no. Oh, here's a good one that I hear. Full power 6 Samurai ruins the format. Let's just take a little look-see daisy at the ban list, you know. Okay, so we can scroll down here. Let's go down to the limited. Oh, legendary 6 Samurai Shien is limited. We got Gateway the 6 limited. We've got Shien Smoke Signal limited. Yeah, definitely not full power. And then the other thing to consider is 6 Samurai kind of just fucking sucks. I'm just gonna start rifling off a few of these remaining cards, you know. First one being Dark Hole. I don't know why people try to like pretend like Dark Hole is like a negative impact on the format. In fact, I would say it's very, very positive to have in the format, because unlike in other formats where people can typically just build a massive board and see no punishment for it, you can just be like, oh, I'm just gonna throw all these cards on the field and it's just gonna stick. Dark Hole adds that kind of like warning in the back of your head where you're like, maybe I need to think a bit before I like go for it, or maybe I need to build my board in a way where I have a backup or a safety if I can't like win this turn. There's a lot of little things that go into it, but for the most part, Dark Hole is extremely healthy. And you also need to think about the fact that We have meta decks running things like Tengu, we got TGs, we got zombies running like Goblin Zombie, there's card troopers running around. There's a ton of floaters in the format, guys, which means Dark Hole isn't really as crazy impactful. Like, usually if you're getting Dark Hole, you're still going to get something back. You know, Tour Guide into Sangan, there's still going to be a search or something that happens as a result of that Dark Hole. So Dark Hole really is just a nice comeback tool that is available to every single deck that both players have to mutually respect when playing their games, which leads to very back and forth gameplay, and honestly really nice risk versus reward extensions versus just I'm always going to extend and try to make a big play because it's just going to win me the game. Vanity's Emptiness. This is a card that a lot of people see and they're like, oh, it's at 3 in the format, I gotta run 3 of them because that card's broken. But the thing about Vanity's Emptiness is it's kind of similar to Maxx C, where until the gameplay of Yu-Gi-Oh! Shifts to a very special summon oriented and very combo heavy oriented gameplay, Vanity's Emptiness just isn't really that good. In fact, a lot of people who try running it typically end up cutting it shortly after because there's just so many outs. There's 3 MST in Tengu Plant format, and there's so many monsters like, you know, big monsters like 1900 beaters that can just swing over a monster, break the vanities. It's honestly not a problem at all. Like, in fact, most people just don't opt to run it, and there's a very clear-cut reason for that. Even in modern iterations of Tengu, the card almost never sees play. It's just not that good. If you haven't caught the point of this so far, I just want to point out that a lot of these cards in the lens of modern can look very, very broken, but when you actually take them to the historical place where they were created, they're nowhere near the level that people remember them as. So try to keep a fresh and open-minded look when playing some of these retro formats or thinking about playing some of these retro formats, because Tengu Plant format ultimately is phenomenal. It's a really, really fun format, and there's counterplay to everything. It's very balanced, very diverse, very skillful. And I just really want to encourage, you know, the end of spreading misinformation about it. You know, at the end of the day, if you feel like it's not a fit for you, I completely understand if you want to justifiably say that, you know, some of these cards you just don't like. Maybe you just really hate BLS, and that's where you draw the line, you know. But I wouldn't say that it's a problem or ruins the format. Maybe it's something that ruins the format for you, but to say that it ruins the format as a whole or makes the format bad, I just would say is inherently incorrect. So, you know, that's pretty much it. That's the point of this whole video is, let's stop trying to spread all this misinformation. Let's, you know, give Tengu Plant the honest shot it deserves, because this format is absolutely incredible. But thank you guys so much for watching. That's going to wrap it up for this video. We'll give a quick shout out to the Patreon. So quick shout out to Perider XIV, Beast Eyes, Slap God, My Dude, Photo Shooty, Brian Ford, and Sven Olbrehend. Thank you guys so much for the support. Other than that, let me know in the comments what you guys think about this. You know, I know everyone's going to have different opinions. Let's try to be civil, but thank you so much for watching. Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe, and have a great time dueling today.